Hello, hello. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another live session at the Reactor. Before we get into the session, please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We're all here to learn, so please be respectful, please be kind, ask a lot of good questions. The chat will be open throughout, and we do encourage you all to participate because this session is for you. So take advantage of it, ask questions. So we're back with the third episode of this Power Platform series with Lewis. Today we're going to be talking about Power Platform and Microsoft Graph better together. If you have missed out on the last two episodes, I will put the link to the YouTube playlist and the series in the chat. So today is the third episode and the final episode will be next week. But with that, I'm now going to bring Lewis up on the stage and let him take this away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rav. It's great to be here again. Yes, hello everyone. Welcome back to this series on activating contextual data with Microsoft Graph, Power Platform and Copilot. Today we are going to be talking about Microsoft Graph and Power Platform better together, as Rav said. This is a really exciting topic, and this is where we start to look at some of the concepts that we talked about in the last episode around contextualized data and things like that. We'll actually start to build some things around those concepts and look at how we can pull Microsoft Graph data and look at the Graph API in particular to pull data out of Microsoft 365 and use that really effectively in a contextual sort of manner when building Power Platform solutions. We'll look at an example in healthcare that's a really simple one, and then we'll actually look at how that solution is put together in the Power Platform, mixing different things like custom connectors, the Graph API, Canvas apps, Dataverse, and model-driven apps. So let's jump in. Just to give you a recap in case you haven't been familiar with the series just yet, as Rav said, the link to the YouTube playlist is actually already in the chat now. If you haven't watched the previous two episodes, go and check those out. They'll be really beneficial in getting you introduced to some of these different concepts and preparing you for what we're going to talk about today. If you're not familiar with me yet, though, I am Lewis. I am a Power Platform customer success architect. I have technology and product expertise across Microsoft 365, Power Platform, and Copilot. I am a dual Microsoft MVP as of a couple of weeks ago in both the Microsoft 365 category and business applications category. I'm the author of Lewis Does Dev. Some of you may be familiar with my blog as Low Code Lewis, which I transitioned from at the start of the year. Last year, I wrote 365 blog posts in 365 days. So if I was that annoying one in your inbox, then hello, that's me. Put a face to the name. I am one of the committee members of the Bletchley Park AI user group. And then I've done a bunch of different things around speaking at Ignite and different awards and things like that. You can scan my QR code or connect with me via my link tree. Let's stay connected on LinkedIn and chat about some of the stuff that we talk about today. As Rav said, please put some stuff in the chat, engage with me in this session, and we can talk about different things. If you've got any questions, put those in as well, and I'll be happy to answer them as we go through. Cool. So let's take a look at what's on today's agenda now. As I said in the previous sessions, we first touched on, an introduction to Power Platform, looking at some of the different, parts of the platform, the different products, Power Apps, Power Automate, how we can build analytics reporting in Power BI, Copilot Studio, and Power Pages. We looked at some concepts around, bringing data into the solutions that we're building with low code with the 1,000 plus connectors that exist in the Power Platform. And we had a little go at actually building something with the Power Platform using Copilot and Dataverse. Then we checked out the Microsoft To Do connector and saw how we can pull data in from other places in Microsoft 365 and perhaps third-party tools with the existing 1,000 plus connectors. And that was what we covered off in session 1. Then in session 2, we looked at concepts around contextualized data and more of the conceptual level to begin with before then diving into a session focused on the more technical elements around Microsoft Graph as a product. We talked about the 3 different components of Microsoft Graph, including the REST API, Graph connectors, and Data Connect. So when you push bigger data sets out to things like Fabric and Azure Synapse, to do more, bigger analytics on things like Outlook data sets, Teams data sets, and Viva data sets. Then we did some examples of what we can actually achieve with the Graph API, which we'll do a bit more of today. And we saw how we can, build some different things with Graph API. Now today, we're going to bring some of those two things together, where we first focused on Power Platform and then second on Microsoft Graph. We're going to bring those things together today. We're going to recap slightly on contextualized data, recap on Microsoft Graph, look at how we interact with connectors and APIs from Power Platform. Then we will talk about something called HTTP authenticated with eventID. We will look at building a solution, and I will take you through a solution that's been pre-built for healthcare, as I said, and we'll look at how things are put together in the Power Platform to take advantage of the Graph API, and then we'll summarize and pull things together at the end before looking at what we're going to cover off in the next session. So, just to recap, this is something that we covered in the last session, and I want to just take you through recapping some of the different things that we focused on so far so that we bring it together and then look at how Graph and Power Platform sit better together as quite close friends. Now, when I talk to a lot of people about Power Platform is almost that thing that touches a lot of different solution areas and spaces in the Microsoft ecosystem, in the Microsoft Cloud ecosystem. You know, Power Platform can take advantage of the stuff that we're doing in the data space. When we are running Power Platform projects, we tend to need maybe a data specialist or a data engineer. It might be that we need someone based in security because we're doing more complex things in that space. It may be that we need UX and design experts. It may be that we're touching on, you know, a bunch of different things that exist across the Microsoft Cloud. It could be AI, data security, etc. And Power Platform really nicely touches over a lot of those different things. And so sometimes in consultancies and different things like that, doesn't always have a designated home because it really does touch across pretty much everything. And it's a really, really cool tool for that different sort of piece. Now, in the last session, we looked at contextualized data as a concept, and we're talking about representations of data whereby relationships between elements of data that are connected but not explicitly represented are uncovered and identified. So we're talking about perhaps looking at how we use data more so than potentially the types of data that we're talking about. We're looking at drawing the lines between different relationships of data and uncovering them where they're not explicitly sort of already drawn for us. So, I mean, people that work in the data space and you're quite familiar with perhaps data modeling and things like that, you'll be fairly familiar with the concept of relational data and drawing relationships between perhaps different tables and columns and things like that. Now, that's more of a structured data scenario, and we're looking at explicitly represented relationships between data in that case, perhaps between, say, a company and its contacts or its employees. That's more of an explicit relationship. Now, what we're looking at here in terms of contextualized data is actually the more implicit relationships and stuff that isn't so explicitly represented, but then we uncover and identify by surfacing a secondary sort of piece of data alongside a primary focus. And we surface that secondary piece of data in a contextualized manner to deliver a better user experience. So we looked at a bunch of these different sort of pieces of data that perhaps might be a good fit for surfacing contextually. Now, one of the things that I want to continue to send away with is that this isn't dependent on the type of data that we're talking about, but rather it's how we use that data. That being said, these are some pretty good examples of data that we could use in a good, you know, contextualized manner. We could surface these different data points in a good way to enhance the UX by surfacing them contextually. Now, on the left side of the screen, we're looking at things around what I'd call the digital ecosystem context and data points that we would consider coming from our digital ecosystem. We're looking at the things that exist in something like Microsoft Graph. We're looking at our customer data in CRM, business commercial data, device information. You know, when you as an employee join an organization and they hand you a device, that device has a relationship with you as an employee and as a user in that organization's Microsoft 365 tenant. So that's a piece of data that we're storing about that person and that device there that perhaps we wouldn't consider unless we were someone sat in IT. But it's something that exists. And it ties into a concept around some of the stuff that we've talked about before around subconsciously created data and some of the stuff that we don't really know so much about, but exists and is very, very useful when we can take advantage of that data. In the middle, we're looking at more things around sort of maybe the middle ground between digital ecosystem context and out the window context. We're talking about operational context, things that are still relevant to the business and still relevant to the organization, but aren't so tech related. You know, we're looking at things like when someone's booked a room. We're looking at what our processes are. Perhaps information like when I've tapped in and out of the office with my key card. Stuff like that. It's, you know, is somebody in the office today or not? And how do I use that data to efficiently book a meeting, with a colleague, to know where we will have that meeting, whether it be on Teams or whether it be in person in the office. If I have that piece of data around whether they're going to be in or whether they are currently in, it helps me make a decision quicker about where we need to have that meeting so that we can gain the most value out of it. So that's an example of using that data contextually to improve the user experience, whereby users can then make decisions that are more impactful much, much faster. And then right on the opposite end of the scale, we're looking at things like out the window context. Now, by this, I'm talking things that don't exist in our digital systems, perhaps in our organization's digital systems. It's not really data points that exist in our organization. It's not things like whether someone's coming to our office or not. But it's more stuff that exists in the public domain, and really is, out the window context. When you're looking out the window, what does the traffic look like? What's the weather like? When you go out of the office, what's public transport like? So it's, the information about those different statuses. Are different roads blocked? Have there been accidents? What does the market look like? Is Azure down today? Can I send an email in an hour's time, etc.? Stuff like that. And these are some of the different points of data that we can use really, really well in a contextualized manner. Now, we looked at a couple of different examples in the previous sessions. I only want to touch on one just to give you a recap. But Siri Suggestions is a fantastic example that I always go back to when thinking about data that's been contextualized. Now, Apple do something slightly further than just contextualizing data here. And what they look at is almost like frequent user patterns. And I suppose almost like a machine learning element, right? So every time you get in the car and connect to Bluetooth or plug your iPhone in, and you go to the same location every morning, it learns that about you as a person. And then it starts to make suggestions based on your user pattern data. So what Apple are doing is they're both learning about the things that you do, but then they're triggering their experiences based on that data being used contextually. And they do that to enhance their user experience and enable better decision-making and action at a much quicker pace. So it really takes out, all of those manual steps of, right, I've gotten in the car, I'm going to connect in, figure out where I'm going, right, I need to put it into maps. Then perhaps I want to turn on Do Not Disturb and set my playlist to work. Apple are really speeding up that process by enhancing the user experience by just triggering different notifications and suggestions right there and then. It's something similar to perhaps what Copilot does and different other tools like Teams Presence. As I said, Copilot is another one of these examples, right? It uses contextualized data sourced from Microsoft 365 to ground large language model responses and enable transformed user workflows. So the way Copilot works is it accepts that user prompt, it searches against enterprise data and real-time plugins before sending that content to the large language model in its pre-processing stage. Then it responds with more helpful content than that of a standalone trained large language model that receives the same prompt, because it has that contextualized data, right? It uses data in a contextualized manner to enhance what it sends back to us, to make that more impactful, to enable us to then make quicker decisions that are, again, more impactful. Now, we're going to keep, moving, quite quickly through this content and dive into a bit of a demo today. But I want to recap on something from our last session in particular around Microsoft Graph. And we're going to pull Microsoft Graph together with the Power Platform today. And to give you a recap on Graph, especially if you weren't in the last session, Graph is basically the gateway to data and intelligence in Microsoft 365 that provides a unified programmability model that you can use to access data in Microsoft 365, Windows and Enterprise Mobility and Security. It's for the purposes of app building, experience extension, and data analysis. So we're not only looking at things like building apps with the data in Microsoft 365, we're looking at perhaps extending those experiences that we've already got in Microsoft 365 with things like graph connectors. We're looking at analyzing the data that exists in Microsoft 365 with things like Data Connect. So the one that we're going to focus on really, really closely today and that we're going to do a lot of work with in terms of integration with Power Platform is the Microsoft Graph API. And now this is the one that we can use to retrieve small pieces of information out from Microsoft 365 to use in a custom user experience or an app or an extension to Microsoft 365. And just to give you a recap, Graph API is effectively a single endpoint to provide access to rich people-centric data and insights in the Microsoft Cloud, including Microsoft 365, Windows, and Enterprise Mobility and Security. So there's a couple of different things to note, including that we've got REST APIs or SDKs available. So in the Power Platform world, working with perhaps HTTP requests or custom connectors and things like that, we're going to work with the REST APIs element. Anyone working with .NET or Python and things like that, you may work with SDKs, and that may speed up your software development approach. Graph gives you access to a tremendous amount of information that lives in Microsoft 365, including apps like Teams. And we have 2 endpoint versions, including both version 1.0, where everything is generally available, and anything that Microsoft, change in the API is all additive, and they don't remove anything from version 1.0. But beta is where they may test things out and get the public sort of, feedback on different things that they are working to move into version 1.0 at general availability. So just before we take a look at, custom connectors and the Power Platform and putting some of this stuff together, I just want to dive back into Graph Explorer. Now, we took a look at this in the last session. Hey, Christian, I can see your comment. It's good for you to be here. Can you guys see that content? Yeah, awesome, fantastic. So we have Graph Explorer up at the moment. This is what we, used in our last session to get familiar with the Graph API, and this is effectively the developer playground that we can use to test out some different things with the Graph API, things that we might uncover in the reference documentation, and stuff like that before we actually go into building software applications and Microsoft 365 extensions and different things like that. Now, I'm just going to give you another quick tour around the Graph Explorer and get you a bit more familiar with this. So taking a look at the stuff down the left-hand side, we have a bunch of different sample queries here. Now, this is just stuff that you can test out right away. Depending, doesn't matter if you're signed into Graph Explorer or not. There are some queries that will require you to be signed in, but the majority you can play around with without having to sign in, and without having to have a commercial tenant. Now, one of the things that I can do straight away is this really simple request up here to get information back about me as a user. Now, if I run this query, this is the API response that I'll get back in JSON about me as a user. And this pulls that data out of Microsoft Entra ID, out of Microsoft 365, and that I can now use to build into my custom applications and Microsoft 365 extensions. So, here I've got information about me as a user. I've got my display name, my given name, my email address. I've got my preferred language, my UPN, and even a GUID for my user, my object ID in Microsoft Entra ID. Now, it may be stuff that I want to get back about my manager. Now, I'm not so sure that this one will work in my tenant because I don't actually have a manager assigned to me in Entra ID. So that's something to keep in mind with Graph Explorer, or not Graph Explorer, sorry, but the Microsoft Graph API in terms of the data that it's actually calling. Now, if you don't have those data points that exist in the background, if there isn't actually a manager assigned to me as a user, it's not going to find that data. Nothing will return. So we're going to get a 404 error, which means that that data wasn't found. And we will actually get a message that comes back from the Graph API to explain what went wrong. So you can see here that in this case, the manager does not exist, or this object isn't present. So you can handle those errors in your applications to make it make sense to users as well. So, there's a bunch of different things. We have an error code and a message here. We can use these to determine what we will then show to our user to explain to them why perhaps a certain thing didn't work. Now, it could be something down here like, I want to see my different to-do task lists. So I'm going to run this query, and you can see what I get, responded right here now is the different lists that I have in Microsoft To Do. I have my task lists and I have my flagged emails. Now, if it's something else that I want to do, perhaps I'm going to capture this ID here, and I actually want to get the tasks back from this tasks list. So I'm going to head over to the resources tab now, and this will basically show me all of the resources available that I can access through the Microsoft Graph REST API. Or the API, sorry, whether you use the REST API or SDKs is up to you, but I'm going to run through here and find tasks or to-dos. I need to jump into me first, and then I'm going to run through here and find to do, and then I'm going to use a get request. Actually, I'm going to step through to lists. I'm going to step through to this request here. I'm going to replace this content here, this to-do task list ID, with the actual ID that I just captured. then I'm going to put a / into the request, and I know this request off by heart, so I can just say that I want to then step into the actual tasks, and I can run this query. And you see back here, I then get a response that gives me all of the tasks that I actually have in that tasks list in Microsoft To Do for me as a user. So I can now use this data in my custom application where the data, we know it as living in Microsoft To Do or in Microsoft 365. So this is really, really cool, right? We can build our own custom applications that utilize the data in Microsoft 365, whether perhaps in the Power Platform we have a connector or not. There are a bunch of additional things where we don't have connectors in the Power Platform, where Graph and the Graph API are a better option for us because we can still get to that data, we just don't have a connector for it. And so what we'll do in those scenarios is perhaps we will use things like HTTP, or we will use custom connectors to get hold of that data where the Graph API will sit behind those things. Now, if we just jump back into a bit of content. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about before we quickly dive back into demo land is custom connectors. Now, we quickly glossed over the idea of interacting with Graph API from the Power Platform. And in some of our first sessions, we looked at just interacting with normal connectors. And we looked at how we can, pull data in from different data sources with connectors in the Power Platform. Now, as I say, there's over 1,000 different connectors that already exist in Power Platform to both Microsoft first-party services and different third-party providers and solutions such as Jira and Salesforce and things like that. Now, with custom connectors, we have the ability to take that a step further. Now, if you haven't got a connector that works for what you're trying to achieve, you can build these out yourself to interact with APIs that might be provided by third-party services or Microsoft, where we don't actually have a Microsoft connector for a Microsoft 365 product. Or perhaps let's say that we do have a connector for Microsoft To Do, but it doesn't quite let us do everything that the Graph API does. In that scenario, we can either use custom connectors to solve our problem by building a custom connector that utilizes the Graph API, or we can work with HTTP requests directly in the Power Platform to retrieve that data from the Graph API. Now, custom connectors basically gives us the ability to create connectors with REST APIs to provide a low-code building block to interacting with third-party services from Power Platform. Now, one of the things that I want to send you away with and to think about when working with the Power Platform is the low-code building blocks that you build as much as the actual end solutions that you build for your users. Now, we can build as many apps and flows as we want, right, which is what's going to support those end users. But commonly, we have to build a bunch of different objects and things and extend things like the Dataverse Common Data Model and things like that to make, to do all of that background work to then build our app or then build our frontline piece of custom logic. Now, when you're building things like custom connectors, think about the other things that are being built in your environment. Think about what other makers are doing. There is no reason that in one environment where we're going to end up in a single production environment in an organization, that 10 different people need to build a presence connector to return presence data from whether someone's available in Microsoft Teams or not. So when you're building these different things, think about how other users can potentially use them, and that you're building a low-code building block to what other people might also be able to do with your solution. Be careful when it comes to different things like solution structuring and solution layering, and dependency issues and things like that. So you need to make sure that you communicate with other makers, but think about how you are building a low-code building block to supporting other people in the platform and in your environments as well. Cool. Now I want to jump back into just taking a quick look at how we interact with data from a Power Platform perspective, just to give a recap on that, and then we will take a look at custom connectors by taking a look at a solution that I have already previously built for healthcare. Now, let's just jump back into the Power App Studio, right? And we will work with an out-the-box connector here quickly. Now, I don't know if anyone remembers from our first episode of this series, but we had Copilot build a solution for technicians and ticketing and different issues that might be coming through to my desk, where we worked with a multiple table schema in Dataverse that Copilot built for us, and it drew a relationship between those tables. We had a lookup from our tickets table to our technicians table, and Copilot built a responsive app that then worked with those different things straight away. So that was really, really cool, right? We worked with a single sentence of natural language where we were then able to build a low-code app with not a single line of code that had things in the background going on, like a relational database with existing security implementation. We have a responsive front end, all ready to already send out to users as a first thing that we might have built as a maker. And that's really, really cool. The next thing that we did was we actually started to look at what we could achieve when we start to do things a little bit more custom, and when we start to click buttons rather than just working with Copilot and natural language. Now, we looked at the concept of having, 1,000+ different connectors that exist out the box in Power Platform, and we added this one here called Microsoft To Do, and it's the one for business as opposed to consumer, where we're pulling To Do data out of our commercial tenant, out of our data that lives in our work account as opposed to our personal account or outlook.live.com tasks. And then we put this gallery on the page, right? And in the items property of the gallery, we put the connector to begin with, the name of the connector that we have in our data tab that lives alongside here. And then to use the different actions that exist in our connector, we use dot notation. So we simply dot in, and then we selected the action to list all to-dos. And then this basically allows you to provide an input parameter that tells you how many to-dos to receive, like a top count. But we're not going to do that in this case, and it's an optional parameter, so we can just provide an open and close bracket to not provide that input. And then we get an output back from the action, back from the API call that lives behind this connector. And you'll see what I mean by that a bit more when we dive into building custom connectors. And then we return data into this gallery control in our Power App, where I have a bunch of the tasks that now exist that actually live in Microsoft To Do, but I'm seeing in my custom application. And now I could do the same thing if I'm developing in the .NET world, or in HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and more of a typical, web page front end, different things like that. But I'm choosing to use Power Apps in this scenario, and that means that I'm able to take advantage of, the actual existing Power Platform connectors rather than having to call those APIs directly. But that being said, those connectors don't give us access to do absolutely everything in the platform. And so that's when we're going to need to take advantage of some of the stuff around custom connectors. Now, let me introduce you to a solution that I've previously built for the healthcare space, where we'll take a look into this solution in a bit more depth and see how we actually build with custom connectors to leverage an API like Microsoft Graph, where we can then start to use a number of different data points that exist for us to take advantage of with our Power Platform solutions, where we can then start to take advantage of data in a contextualized manner. Now, we had a problem here in the healthcare world where we had a scenario where perhaps there is a reduced staff count on a ward and a reduced pool of support that we actually need to service patients on a ward and help them out with what they actually need at that point in time, right? And so we needed a solution that would effectively let us speed up calls for clinical assistance. Now, we had a bunch of different issues around time wasted searching for those clinicians who had the needed skill set for what we need for patients. We had issues around those clinicians' availability, time wasted contacting them in multiple different applications such as Teams or Outlook to request their support, even after we've then actually matched their skills to begin with, checked that they're not available in Outlook, or checked that they're not in a meeting in Outlook, and then contacted them via Teams. And so we needed a solution that pulled those perhaps 3 different platforms together and 3 different interfaces that a user would have to step through just to request someone's help, into a single Canvas app front end built with the Power Platform that contacted different APIs like Microsoft Graph and things like that to surface clinicians with suitable skill set and their availability, and a quick link to contact them and request that they exist at the current location that the app is set to. And so that really sped up that process, right? Instead of a user having to go to perhaps, a piece of paper to check that that person actually has the right skill set, and then they have to go to Outlook to check that they're not in a meeting, then they have to go to Teams to check that their presence is on a green tick and they're available, to then message them and say, hey, can you help me with this? They've already spent maybe like 5 minutes figuring that thing out. Instead, We've sped up that process by putting everything in a single interface where it already checks their calendar, it checks their team's presence and their availability, and then we can contact them with a click of a single button to get their assistance. So we're going to jump into a bit of a demo around how we would actually build a solution like this. And this will give you a bit of a better idea around some of the stuff that we can do with custom connectors and different things like that, to be able to interact with some of those APIs that we maybe don't have a connector for that already exists in the Power Platform. Now, I am going to jump into make.powerapps.com. I'm going to step out of this app for now. And now I'm going to switch to my development environment in the Power Platform. One of the concepts to become familiar with in Power Platform is the different environments that we can work with and how that supports different concepts like application lifecycle management and data boundaries and different things like that. So if I go ahead and select my development environment here, I have something called in the Power Platform called solutions. This is another concept to become familiar with. And solutions basically give me the capability to package up the thing that I'm working on and make it, provide a capability around lifting and shifting that thing, that solution, that collection of different things that I've used to build, what fixes my problem, and lifting and shifting those between those environments that we literally just spoke about. Now I'm going to scroll through here to actually find the solution that I worked on in this example and that we're going to take a look at today. And it's called Call a Clinician. We just spoke about it in the slide, right? And now we're going to step through the solution to try and understand some of the different components that exist and how these, sort of come together to support building something in the Power Platform where we utilize an API where perhaps we don't have a connector to then retrieve that piece of data that we need and then surface it contextually in an application to improve the user experience and enable people to make decisions much faster that are much more effective and impactful. So let's start to jump through some of this stuff. I'm going to begin with apps. And actually, let's take a look at these tables as well to begin with. Now, what we've got here is both a model-driven app and a Canvas app. We're going to take a look at the model-driven app to begin with. And just before we jump into that, I want you to be aware of some other stuff that we've got in the solution that will make this make sense when we get into that model-driven app. Now, we've got two other things down here in the table section in this solution. I've got a table for hospital locations and I've got a table for skills. Now, one of the things that I have in the Power Platform that we've spoken about already is the concept of Dataverse and Microsoft's low-code data platform that exists out of the box integration for us to really, really easily build custom applications with low code where we're not doing any sort of harsh data integration work or calling REST APIs and things like that, just to be able to integrate with a data store. Now, we're utilizing Dataverse in this scenario to store our hospital locations and skills. So if you ever see tables in a solution, this is, Dataverse is the place that it's storing those tables and data in. Now, we've got this model-driven app here. Model-driven apps surface typically when we're talking about standard custom tables or standard tables in the common data model. They typically surface just Dataverse tables. They also surface different things like virtual tables where we can pull data in from other sources like Dynamics, Finance and Operations, or SQL or SharePoint or places like that. But typically we're working with data that primarily exists in Dataverse. Now, if I jump into this model-driven app, we saw those two tables in our solution, right, that exist in Dataverse, our skills table and our hospital locations table. Now, those are things that we can now manage inside of this model-driven app where the UI is already built for us. We don't have to do any of that. Now, I know we did that in Canvas apps with Copilot, but the UI typically looks very, very similar in a model-driven app from model-driven app to model-driven app. Now, we can do a bunch of different things to customize this, and that is absolutely a capability. But typically, this will look fairly similar between different model-driven apps that you go through and that you flick between. Now, what we've got here to begin with is this concept of hospital locations. Now, it's really important that when I'm requesting support from a clinician, that I get them to come to the right place. So this is some data that we're going to need people to be aware about. So we store hospital locations in this table here, and we reference that later on in the journey. Then we have the concept of skills. Now, this is the first data point that we're going to use when making a call for clinical assistance. We actually need to know that that person has that skill set. We need someone for a blood test. We don't just need a clinician. Now, I'm going to select one of these skills here, and we can create new skills for different needs that we might have in wards and things like that. But if I select blood test to begin with, I'm then going to see what's called a subgrid, or this sort of related data to this record around clinicians that actually have this skill. So this is almost a related set of data around clinicians. Okay, so we have that almost explicit data relationship between skills and clinicians. That's more of a firm, explicit data relationship as opposed to a contextualized or implicit data relationship that we might need to uncover. And so we've got these two records related here where I, Lewis, have the skills to complete a blood test for someone. I don't. Please don't think I do. And that's just what we're testing out in this demo. So this is our model-driven app. We're going to jump back into our solution now. So we understand that concept around us relating those two different data points and us matching clinicians up to skill sets in the background. That's some data that we're storing that we're going to later use down the journey. Now, we're going to jump through a couple of additional things in our solution, right? So I'm going to jump into this one here for custom connectors. Now, we spoke about this earlier in the deck. We talked about the concept of interacting with APIs from the Power Platform where we might not have a connector out the box to be able to do that with. And so in this scenario, we can either interact with HTTP requests directly in things like Power Automate flows, or HTTP authenticated with Microsoft Entra ID in both Power Apps and Power Automate. Or we can build our own custom connectors where we can interact with any API, not just Microsoft Entra ID secured APIs, but any REST API in the form of a connector ready to use in either Power Apps or Power Automate. So I have a custom connector here. Now, in this scenario, we wouldn't necessarily have to use a custom connector because the API that lives behind this connector is Microsoft Entra ID secured. Now, that means that we could use the connector that exists out the box for HTTP with Entra ID authentication. Now, that's just one option. We can also go ahead with this option, and I'm going to go ahead with this option today to give you a bit of a better understanding around what you can do with other APIs that aren't secured with Microsoft Entra ID, and where Microsoft Entra ID doesn't handle the authentication and authorization of those API endpoints. Now, let's jump directly into this custom connector to begin with, and we'll take a look at some of the stuff that we notice when we get into the security tab. But to begin with, we have the general information of this custom connector to begin with, and we can provide a connector icon, a background color, and the kind of things that people will see when they go to select that connector to build with in Power Platform, in Power Apps, in Power Automate, before they select triggers and actions, perhaps in a flow. We can provide a description, which they'll also see in those experiences. Then we can start to actually work on this connector and more of the information about it. So we set the scheme to begin with. So either HTTPS, that's secured version, or HTTP. Then we set the host. And what you've noticed here perhaps is that this isn't, a typical host URL of a REST API. And what we're doing here is we're actually referencing another object that is inside of our solution called an environment variable. Now, I'm just going to quickly jump back to our solution to get you familiar with this concept. Now, environment variables are something that allows us to make environment level changes when we pick up our solution. That idea of picking up all of the things that contribute to our business problem that we've built with Power Platform. And environment variables allow us to alter things in that solution when we pick it up and move it to a different place, when we move it to a different environment. So when I take my solution from perhaps a development environment into a live production environment ready for users to take advantage of and people to use my solution, there may be some slight different changes I want to make. Perhaps I have an environment variable of email type where in a flow, I send errors that are noticed in that flow to a different person when it's actually a live issue to when it's a development issue. Perhaps I have a different colleague that works on production and live issues to someone that works on issues that haven't gotten to production and that are in development at the moment. That's a really simple example. But what I have here is a number of environment variables that allow me to alter things in my custom connector and fields and different configuration options in my custom connector between environments. So one of the things that I have to set up to be able to interact with the Graph API in an actual Microsoft 365 tenant is an app registration in Microsoft Entra ID or in Microsoft Azure, which then basically handles the authentication and authorization element for me to interact with that REST API. Now, out the back of that app registration, I get a number of different things. I get a client ID for that app. I have the host for the actual endpoint and the authorization element. I have a resource URL, i.e. Microsoft Graph, the endpoint. I have a secret for authenticating before I authorize. I have a tenant ID to tell the API which Microsoft 365 tenant to look at before it can handle that authentication piece. So I have all of this different data that is essential for me to handle the authentication and authorization elements, right? But if I'm working in development, I may be using a different app registration to the one that I might use in production. And that's just so that perhaps if I'm working in development and making changes, for the users that are maybe already live in production, I'm not affecting them by making any of those changes. And so the way that I manage to do this and make those changes at an environment level are with environment variables. If I was to go and edit those custom connectors directly, I may increase the scope to me creating some more issues, or me creating what's called unmanaged layers on managed solutions when I deploy them to production or target environments such as test, QA, UAT, production, training, etc. Now, what that means is that in development, I need a way for my custom connector to take a look at the values that exist inside of my environment variable. So each of these environment variables will have a data type, and then it will hold a current value. So in this scenario, my host is obviously going to be graph.microsoft.com. And what you'll see is when we step into the general tab, I reference my environment variable with this syntax here. So I provide an @ then I type environment variables and capitalize the V in variables. Then I provide an open bracket and quotations. And inside of those quotations, I provide the name that's provided here, this name here, that we can copy under advanced. And then I provide that inside of those quotation marks. Now, that basically allows me to reference the value that's being stored inside of my environment variable. Now, let's start to jump through this custom connector a little bit more. So I then work on the security element. I'm again referencing environment variables in this part. I'm choosing to work with OAuth 2.0, where the identity provider is Azure Active Directory or Microsoft Entra ID. And here I'm referencing all of the different parts that I gain out of that app registration. So it's client ID, the secret that I can use to authenticate against it, and the tenant ID. I then have the authorization URL and resource URL that I'm going to use, and that's me done on my authentication part. If you're not familiar with these concepts, there's a bunch of documentation at Microsoft Learn that I will comment in the chat once we're finished, that exists around different things for understanding concepts around OAuth 2 and auth flows and different things like that to get familiar with around this concept. But cool, we will dive into the definition of this custom connector next. And now this is where I actually build out the different actions and triggers that exist in the connectors that you might be familiar with when working with the ones that exist out the box. Now, when you go and select a connector in a flow and you select a trigger or an action, this is what lives behind those. And so to begin with, when I create a new action, I've only got one action in this custom connector. I don't have any triggers. We're not going to look at triggers today, and webhooks and things like that. But when I work with actions, I'm looking at making API requests with almost like that low-code building block that sits on the front. So I give it a bit of information. I provide an operation ID, which is a unique string to identify the operation. So this has to be different from your other actions. And then I choose this button here that lets me import from sample. And I provide what the request will actually look like if I was to make a HTTP request. I provide the method, so it may be a GET request, which is what I'm doing in this scenario. I provide the request URL and any headers that I have to provide as part of the request. If I have a scenario where I need to dynamically fill in a field for the request, perhaps it's the user ID or something like that, I can go ahead and in the request URL, I can add curly braces around what that parameter will be. And inside of the curly braces, I provide the name of the parameter. So that when I actually save that and import the sample, I then get this concept around parameters that I can use to dynamically populate different parts of the request URL and headers and things like that when it actually comes to using that action in a flow or in an app. So then the final part that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run a test. Now, let me just pick up a user ID quickly, because that's actually one of the parameters that we need to provide as part of making this request. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up the object ID of a user in Microsoft Enter ID in my tenant, and that's going to be my object ID. So we're now going to test this operation, and you can see I get a green tick back, a status of 200 for the API request, and we can see that I'm actually busy at the moment and I'm in a meeting. It's this one right now. Cool. So we can see that that's working. Great. Now we need to figure out how we actually use this custom connector when it comes to building in Power Apps. So I'm going to head back to my solution. And we had another app that lives in the solution, right? Actually, the thing that we were trying to build, Call a Clinician, that solution to speeding up clinical requests for clinical assistance in wards. So I'm going to go ahead and select this example right now and jump into the edit mode of this Canvas app. It's something that we looked at in that first episode in the series, where we talked through building with Copilot and working with Dataverse and building that, multi-table schema and relational data schema to supporting desk tickets and technicians and things like that. We're back in this, Canvas App Studio now, and I'm just going to override the capability to edit because I had this open earlier. And what I've got here is the app that I've previously built. Now let's jump through some of the stuff that I've got here. If we take a look at this left-hand bar straight away, we can see this custom connector that I actually built, right? So we have this presence connector here that we just looked at and that we were just stepping through. That is now a connector that lives inside of my app. So similar to how you might call Microsoft Teams or Office 365 users, or perhaps Microsoft To Do, which is the business connector that we worked with earlier in the session and in the first session. In the same scenario, we actually have our custom connector here where we can step into the actions that exist in that connector now by providing it in PowerFX and using dot notation to get to those different requests. Now, let's just step through some of the different other things that I've got in this app. I have a gallery here that takes a look at my skills table in Dataverse. So you remember that model-driven app and that Dataverse table that we, assigned clinicians with different skills using. I'm now referencing that skills data in this app. I'm also referencing the data around the different wards and hospital locations that we set up in that model-driven app. So I'm going to go ahead and select Ward 3 as the location that I'm actually currently on. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select one of these different skills that I need to take me to the next point in this journey, the next part in this app. And just to give you an idea of how that works, I have a bunch of different screens in this app, right? So I have the skills screen, I have the people screen. The skills screen is where I'm selecting the skill that I want from a clinician, the skill I need support with. And then the people screen is where I'm going to list out the clinicians that could help in that scenario and their current availability, which is that contextualized piece of data that I'm surfacing alongside the primary focus being that person that could help. So what I've got here is the onSelect property of a button that I've laid over these different skills. Now, what I'm doing is I'm saying, when this button is selected, using the onSelect property, I want to navigate to the people screen. I'm going to use a transition fade. So I'm going to make the screen look quite nice and transition with a fade as I move from the skills screen to the people screen. And then the third parameter that I have as part of the navigate function in PowerFX is the ability to take data with me from one screen to another with what's called a context variable. Now, I'm going to create a context variable by providing an object here, and I'm going to set the property LOC skill to this item. Now, this item is a dynamic value that we can get out of the gallery by referencing the current record that's being selected in the gallery. If I selected blood test, it would pull that record or that skill. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to step back into play mode and select blood test. And then straight away, this Power App with the logic behind it has gone and made a request to Dataverse to begin with, where it's looked at the clinicians that we had matched up against that skill in that model-driven app. So that's the first piece. That's the first primary piece of information we need, right? We need the person that can help us in this scenario. But what's not helpful is we don't know if they're available or busy or something like that. So what we've got then is a second piece of data that we're returning from our custom connector and Microsoft Graph, which is the presence and the availability of that user. And that's when we're using data contextually to enhance the user experience, where now I don't need to flick to Teams. I don't need to flick to that second platform to find out if that person is available. I'm doing it all in this one place because I'm referencing other data points and surfacing the information in a contextual manner. So I can see that Lewis is busy at the moment and we don't have any other clinicians listed. So at the moment, I'm going to have to wait, but that so happens to be because Lewis is doing a demo on Power Platform and Microsoft Graph better together. So he can't help with a blood test right now, nor can he probably ever do that, right? But if Lewis was available and was actually able to do a blood test, we would be able to then select this Teams icon here, where now a message has been sent to Lewis to go ahead and help out with that scenario. And that really speeds up that process, right? So if I just take you through to this piece as well and show you the outcome of that for the clinician on the end, what we had when we selected that icon was a Power Automate flow in the background that sent the user or sent that clinician a notification to say, look, we need your help with this skill, and this is the location that we need you at, based on that hospital location that I set at the beginning of the journey when I started in this Canvas app, right? So we used two pieces of data there, actually. We used the skill and we used the location that we needed the person at. And prior to that, we used data from Microsoft Graph contextually to understand whether that person was available or not. So rather than going from Outlook Calendar, perhaps, to Microsoft Outlook Calendar to check if that person's in a meeting or not, then to Microsoft Teams to check if they're available or not, and then to actually writing them a message to see if they can come and help us, we simply selected a skill. So we knew that person could do that thing. That was already an explicit data relationship that had been created for us and that we could take advantage of. Then Microsoft Graph told us if that person was available or not. We didn't have to go to a second platform to check out that thing. And then finally, we used automation to send that person a message where I didn't have to type that whole thing out myself. So instead of spending 5 minutes on something, let's see how long this takes. Let's jump back into this application and try it again. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and pick another skill. I've selected Ward 3, selected blood test. It took me a matter of seconds to find out who I could potentially call on assistance for to help me in the current scenario. And then an additional 1 second to send that person a message. Now, sure, I may need to now check Teams to find out if they're actually going to come and help me or not. But that 5-minute to 10-minute process of perhaps scanning through a piece of paper to check out, different clinician skill sets, to then going to Outlook to finding out if they're in a meeting or not, to then going to Teams to send them a message, where that took 5 to 10 minutes, I took seconds to speed this process up, to make this so much faster. So that's how we can really, really simply, this is a very, very simple use case of us using data contextually to enhance the user experience and speed up a process to enhance the user experience and to make those decisions and different processes more impactful. Now, let's take a look at what's coming up. So in the next episode and the final episode in this series, we're going to bring things together a little further. And we're actually going to start to bring Copilot back in at this point. Not only are we going to look at Power Platform Microsoft Graph together, we're actually going to bring in Copilot for Microsoft 365 and look at how we can build powerful digital solutions using contextualized data with Microsoft Graph, low code, and Microsoft Copilot for Microsoft 365. We're running again next Thursday from 5 till 6 p.m. On British Summer Time. If you are not already registered and you're watching this on recap on YouTube, be sure to go to aka.ms/pp series JUL and sign up for the next episode of the series, and I will see you there. That is everything from me for today, guys. If there's any other questions, drop them in the comments, or feel free to put them in the comments of the YouTube recording afterwards, and I will check that out and respond to some of those. Otherwise, you can connect with me on LinkedIn and different things like that, and we will stay in touch. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lewis. We don't have any questions, so I guess we'll wrap up the session here.
Awesome. Thanks, Rav.
Thanks.